In an age torn between collapsing empires and rising ambitions, a voice echoed through the sands of Arabia, a voice that would shake the world. From the scorched valleys of Mecca to the marble courts of Cordoba and the golden domes of Baghdad, this is the untold epic of how a revelation sparked a revolution and how that revolution became a civilization. The old powers were crumbling, Byzantium was weary, Persia was bleeding. Across the deserts, a message began to spread: one God, one community, one destiny. But Islam was not born in silence. It rose through conflict and conviction, through battles fought not only with swords, but with ideas. It endured exile, faced civil wars, shattered old orders, and forged a new vision of faith, law, and power. From the first believers rallying behind a prophet in Medina, to the armies of the Rashidun carving a path from Arabia to the edges of Asia and Africa, to the Umayyad caliphs building an empire from Spain to India, to the Abbasids igniting a golden age of science, philosophy, and art, to the Ottomans standing at the gates of Constantinople, ready to claim the last legacy of Rome. This is not just a story of prophets and caliphs, it is a story of empires rising and falling, of identities shaped and reshaped, of a faith that refused to be confined to the margins of history. This documentary will unfold in two parts. Part 1 follows the birth of Islam and its rise under the Prophet Muhammad, the Rashidun caliphs, and the Umayyad dynasty. Part 2 begins with the Abbasid revolution and carries us through centuries of change, culminating in the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. This is the complete saga, from revelation to empire. This is the history of Islam. In an age defined by faith and conquest, a new empire would rise from the shadows, forever transforming the destiny of Europe. This is the story of Spain's turbulent rebirth, of kingdoms destroyed, ancient beliefs challenged, and warriors whose names echo through history. From the proud halls of Visigothic kings to the fierce battle cries of Berber invaders, Iberia stood on the edge of a blade, waiting for a storm it did not see coming. In the year 711 AD, the pillars of the old world began to crumble as armies emerged from beyond the sea, carrying a new faith, determined to claim a continent. When Tariq ibn Ziyad led his men across the narrow straits, he faced a land fractured by rivalry and doubt, an empire teetering toward collapse. The Visigothic kingdom, confident in its divine favor, was blind to the peril at its doorstep. Its king, Roderick, marched into battle certain of victory, yet destiny had other plans. What followed was a relentless wave of conquest, a saga written in blood, fire, and the collision of civilizations. Within mere years, ancient cities fell, sacred temples burned, and new rulers replaced old. The proud legacy of Rome and the Visigoths vanished beneath the banners of Al-Andalus. Yet amid the ashes of defeat and conquest, a new order arose, magnificent, ambitious, and complex. A world of splendor, scholarship, and ruthless power struggles was born. Cordoba would rise, radiant in its golden age, becoming Europe's beacon of knowledge and luxury, admired and envied across continents. But before we witness the heights of this great empire, we must journey through its birth, through the desperate cries of fallen kingdoms and the triumphal chants of conquerors. This is not merely a tale of kings and caliphs, nor only of victories and defeats. This is the story of peoples and beliefs clashing in a desperate quest for supremacy and survival, of warriors, scholars, and rulers navigating a new uncertain age. This is the story of Al-Andalus. By the middle of the 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula, known now as Al-Andalus, had fallen firmly under Muslim control. In our previous video exploring the rise and expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate, we covered in depth the initial Islamic conquest of Iberia in 711 AD, led by the Berber commander Tariq ibn Ziyad, as well as the subsequent wars against the Frankish kingdoms, culminating in the decisive Battle of Tours in 732. For 4 decades after the initial conquest in 711, Andalusia remained a distant peripheral province, vulnerable to local rebellions and internal rivalries. But the most dramatic transformation in its history was yet to come, and it would begin with one man's harrowing journey and extraordinary survival. In the year 750, the Umayyad dynasty, the first great ruling house of the Islamic Empire, faced annihilation at the hands of a new rival dynasty, the Abbasids. Their victory was absolute and brutal. Historian Hugh Kennedy, professor of Arabic at SOAS, University of London, describes this pivotal moment starkly. The Abbasids systematically hunted down and eliminated nearly every member of the Umayyad royal family. The dynasty that had ruled the greatest empire on earth was exterminated in a single ruthless purge. Yet one young Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, grandson of the Caliph Hisham, survived. Abd al-Rahman's story, recounted vividly by historian Maribel Fierro, research professor at the Spanish National Research Council, is often likened to that of Aeneas escaping the destruction of Troy. Hunted relentlessly by Abbasid assassins, he fled westward across North Africa, a fugitive prince whose chances of survival seemed impossibly slim. After 5 years on the run, always just a step ahead of his pursuers, Abd al-Rahman finally reached the shores of Iberia in 755. At that moment, Al-Andalus itself was fractured, its rulers bitterly divided by tribal and ethnic tensions between Arabs, Berbers, and Syrians. Abd al-Rahman, still young and without allies, recognized both danger and opportunity in this fragmented landscape. With exceptional diplomatic skill and the undeniable prestige of his Umayyad heritage, he quickly rallied supporters in Andalusia. Fierro highlights Abd al-Rahman's remarkable strategic insight. Though initially powerless, Abd al-Rahman skillfully exploited local rivalries. Promising unity under his leadership, within a year he turned himself from refugee into ruler. In 756, Abd al-Rahman entered Cordoba triumphantly, swiftly overthrowing local governors who had refused his legitimacy. With striking confidence, he declared an independent emirate, severing all political and religious ties to the Abbasid Caliphate. By deliberately refusing to acknowledge Abbasid supremacy, even going as far as banning prayers in their honor, Abd al-Rahman made clear that Al-Andalus would follow its own independent destiny. His boldest statement of independence was the construction of Cordoba's great mosque, the Mezquita. Although built on the foundations of a former Visigothic cathedral dedicated to John the Baptist, Abd al-Rahman's choice of location was as politically symbolic as it was religious. As Fierro explains, by placing the mosque on the site of Cordoba's cathedral, Abd al-Rahman symbolically asserted his sovereignty, announcing that Al-Andalus was no mere province, but a distinct political and religious entity. This decision has sparked vigorous historiographical debate among historians. While traditional narratives portray the mosque's location as evidence of Islamic tolerance and cultural continuity, scholars like Simon R. Doubleday, professor of history at Hofstra University, offer a more nuanced perspective, arguing it represented both cultural continuity and political domination, reflecting the complex, layered identities of early Islamic Spain. Under Abd al-Rahman's rule, Cordoba quickly became an urban and economic powerhouse, rivaling any city in Europe. The city's vibrant markets overflowed with goods from distant lands, reflecting its newfound prosperity and extensive trade networks reaching as far as Byzantium, North Africa, and the Middle East. Yet beneath this prosperity lay complex social dynamics. Abd al-Rahman understood well the necessity of balancing diverse populations: Arabs, Berbers, Syrians, Christians, and Jews. His political acumen ensured relative internal peace despite persistent tensions beneath the surface. By the time of his death in 788, Abd al-Rahman I had laid firm foundations for an enduring civilization. From exile and persecution, he had built a lasting legacy, transforming Iberia from a distant imperial frontier into an independent and self-confident emirate. His heirs would inherit this ambitious vision, elevating Córdoba to even greater heights. Yet the political fractures and ethnic divisions Abd al-Rahman confronted were never truly resolved, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to erupt again. And when they did, the consequences would reshape Al-Andalus and Europe forever. By the beginning of the 10th century, the unified state built by Abd al-Rahman I was fragmenting into chaos. Local governors and warlords, both Arab and Berber, openly defied Córdoba, erecting fortresses on every strategic hillside. Central authority was in retreat, and the rich civilization built by the Umayyads seemed poised to collapse. Yet, in 912 AD, a remarkable figure rose to the throne in Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman III, who would restore unity and transform Al-Andalus into Europe's most sophisticated medieval civilization. Born in 889 AD, Abd al-Rahman III ascended the throne at the age of 23. Though he lacked the charisma or battlefield prowess typical of medieval warrior kings, Abd al-Rahman was disciplined, pragmatic, and meticulous. Historian Maribel Fierro, Spanish National Research Council, Madrid, describes him as a leader, defined by his extraordinary organizational talent. Abd al-Rahman III was methodical and systematic. He approached ruling not as a warrior or visionary mystic, but as a masterful administrator who saw order as the foundation of prosperity. His methods were relentless and methodical, city by city, fortress by fortress. Abd al-Rahman systematically crushed local rebellions, dismantled the fortifications of rival warlords, and centralized authority. Historian Hugh Kennedy, professor at SOAS University of London, emphasizes Abd al-Rahman's impact succinctly. What Abd al-Rahman achieved was nothing short of a reconquest, systematically restoring territories that had fragmented under previous rulers. His restoration was less about grand battles than meticulous planning and relentless determination. By 929, Abd al-Rahman had subdued all significant opposition, achieving unprecedented economic prosperity and political stability. Emboldened, he took the decisive step of proclaiming himself Caliph, the highest possible religious and political authority in the Muslim world, in direct defiance of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This act was more than symbolic. It signaled his ambition to transform Córdoba from a provincial capital into a rival of Constantinople and Baghdad. Abd al-Rahman's Córdoba quickly blossomed into Europe's largest city, home to more than 100,000 inhabitants. Córdoba was Europe's largest metropolis, dwarfing Paris or London at the time. Yale historian Maria Rosa Menocal famously describes the city's breathtaking cultural and intellectual environment. Under Abd al-Rahman III, Córdoba was Europe's intellectual beacon, unrivaled in cosmopolitan brilliance. Its libraries, scholars, and lavish courts attracted diplomats and intellectuals from across the known world. To further demonstrate his wealth and ambition, Abd al-Rahman constructed the magnificent palace city of Medina Azahara, just outside Córdoba. It served as a visual statement of imperial authority, much like Versailles centuries later. Visitors, such as John of Gauza, an abbot from the Rhineland, were stunned by its luxurious splendor, writing of elaborate gardens, fountains flowing with fresh water, zoos filled with exotic animals, and even a vast pool of mercury designed to dazzle visiting dignitaries. This spectacle reinforced Abd al-Rahman's imperial image, impressing even distant Christian monarchs and Byzantine emperors. Yet behind this glittering facade lay more complex social realities. Abd al-Rahman III himself embodied the diverse ethnic and religious complexities of Al-Andalus. Though Umayyad on his father's side, his mother was a Frankish Christian concubine, leaving him with blonde hair and blue eyes, features he famously dyed and darkened to better match his Arab ancestry. Historians note this personal insecurity as reflecting broader tensions in Andalusi society, where Arabs, Berbers, Slavs, Christians and Jews coexisted, yet each group occupied clearly defined social positions. This complexity has sparked intense historiographical debates about the nature of tolerance and multiculturalism in Al-Andalus. While scholars like Menakal emphasize the vibrant intellectual and cultural exchanges, historian Simon R. Doubleday, professor at Hofstra University, insists on a more cautious reading. Al-Andalus combined genuine coexistence with carefully maintained social hierarchies. Religious and ethnic boundaries remained strictly enforced, and tolerance always operated within an explicitly Muslim framework. Abd al-Rahman's Caliphate, therefore, was no simple multicultural utopia. Its sophisticated administration, global trading networks, and rich intellectual life rested firmly on structures of authority that explicitly privileged Islamic identity and culture. Yet despite its limits, the brilliance of Córdoba under Abd al-Rahman III deeply impressed medieval Europe, setting standards of urban sophistication and governance that would influence European political and cultural ambitions for centuries. In a private diary entry, Abd al-Rahman III poignantly reflected on his own melancholy life, famously writing, "I have diligently numbered the days of pure and genuine happiness which have fallen to my lot. They amount to 14. This melancholy confession provides a haunting personal insight into a man who outwardly embodied the pinnacle of medieval political power, but inwardly remained isolated and dissatisfied, capturing the paradox at the heart of Al-Andalus itself, rich, confident, yet perpetually unstable beneath the surface. Yet his legacy, though complex, is undeniable. By Abd al-Rahman's death in 961, Al-Andalus had become a central node connecting East and West, its influence resonating far beyond its borders, shaping European culture, science, and even political organization. However, the seeds of its eventual collapse had already begun to sprout. After Abd al-Rahman's death, new tensions, growing internal conflicts and aggressive militarization under later leaders would unravel the very prosperity and unity he had painstakingly rebuilt. The dazzling lights of Córdoba's golden age were beginning to dim, setting the stage for the Caliphate's dramatic fall, and with it, the transformation of European history forever. In the popular imagination, Al-Andalus often evokes images of multicultural harmony, a paradise where Muslims, Christians and Jews lived together peacefully, exchanging knowledge and culture beneath palm trees and babbling fountains. But as historians have extensively debated, the reality of life in medieval Islamic Spain was far more complicated. Indeed, the question of Al-Andalus's supposed tolerance remains one of the most nuanced and passionately argued issues in medieval historiography. Historian Maria Rosa Menokal, professor at Yale University and author of the acclaimed work The Ornament of the World, famously emphasizes Al-Andalus as a rare historical moment of cultural coexistence. Córdoba represented a remarkable medieval experiment where Jews, Christians and Muslims engaged in unprecedented intellectual collaboration, transcending the strict religious divisions that characterized most of Europe. Menokal highlights the intellectual vibrancy of Córdoba, where scholars of various faiths came together to translate and preserve Greek and Roman texts that would eventually spark Europe's intellectual renaissance centuries later. This vision of Al-Andalus as a haven of scholarly coexistence resonates powerfully with modern audiences seeking historical examples of multicultural harmony. Yet historians caution against romanticizing this narrative. Simon R. Doubleday, professor of medieval history at Hofstra University, argues firmly that multiculturalism in Al-Andalus, though real, was always hierarchical. Tolerance in Al-Andalus existed within clear and legally enforced social hierarchies. Muslims unquestionably held political and social supremacy, while Jews and Christians were protected but distinctly subordinated. Doubleday reminds us that the protection provided to non-Muslims came with clear conditions. Christians and Jews were classified as dhimmis, people of the book, permitted to practice their faiths, but subject to specific taxes and social restrictions under Islamic law. For example, the jizya, a tax mandated by Islamic law on non-Muslims, served as a constant reminder of their inferior social status. The very existence of such a tax, Doubleday points out, indicates that Andalusian tolerance was conditional, never absolute. A poignant reflection of these underlying tensions can be seen clearly in the phenomenon of the martyrs of Córdoba during the mid-9th century. This extraordinary episode involved Christian individuals deliberately provoking the Islamic authorities by publicly denouncing the Prophet Muhammad, seeking martyrdom as a spiritual protest against cultural marginalization. Historian Hugh Kennedy, professor of Arabic at SOAS, University of London, describes these events vividly. The martyrs of Córdoba were symptomatic of the anxieties and tensions underpinning coexistence. While the Islamic authorities were largely uninterested in persecution, Christian defiance indicated profound resistance to cultural assimilation. This martyrdom phenomenon illustrates the limits of multicultural coexistence. While officially tolerated, Christians in Córdoba faced social pressures so severe that they resorted to deliberate martyrdom as an act of spiritual and cultural defiance. The complexity of religious coexistence also extended into scholarly endeavors. The libraries of Córdoba, famously containing hundreds of thousands of volumes, were undoubtedly centers of learning where Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars interacted. Yet, as historian Hugh Kennedy explains, scholarly exchange did not imply social equality. Jewish and Christian intellectuals were vital to the cultural achievements of Al-Andalus, yet they remained second-class citizens. Their participation, though critical, was always subordinate to the dominant Muslim culture. Still, the scholarly collaboration fostered by this coexistence was crucial for the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge. When Christian forces later retook key cities like Toledo in the 11th century, these translated Greek and Arabic texts profoundly influenced European intellectual history, laying the foundations for the European Renaissance. Thus, the legacy of Al-Andalus as a multicultural haven, though imperfect and hierarchical, undeniably shaped European intellectual history. Ultimately, the debate over tolerance in Al-Andalus reflects broader questions about medieval society itself. Modern views of a tolerant Al-Andalus, historians caution, often project contemporary ideals onto a very different past. Yet, at the same time, entirely dismissing the unique coexistence of Al-Andalus ignores a genuine historical achievement. Despite inherent limitations, Córdoba did represent a rare space of relative religious and cultural exchange unmatched in medieval Europe. In the words of Monocal, this complexity may be exactly what makes Al-Andalus so fascinating. Al-Andalus challenges simplistic interpretations. It was neither paradise nor hell, but something far more intriguing, a society whose complexity still offers profound lessons for today. Thus, Al-Andalus was neither purely utopian nor entirely oppressive, but a nuanced historical example of both the potential and limitations inherent in cultural coexistence. The splendor and prosperity of Cordoba's golden age under Abd al-Rahman III seemed poised to last indefinitely, but beneath the luxurious facade lurked deep vulnerabilities. After Abd al-Rahman III's death, his successors struggled to maintain the empire's internal cohesion, setting the stage for ambitious figures to seize power from behind the throne. Foremost among these was Muhammad ibn Abi Amir, known to history as Al-Mansur, the Victorious. Born around 938 AD to a relatively modest family, Al-Mansur rose rapidly through the ranks of Cordoba's court, propelled by his intelligence, ruthlessness, and political ambition. Initially appointed as vizier, chief minister, during the reign of the passive Caliph Hisham II, Al-Mansur quickly consolidated control, reducing the Caliph himself to a mere symbolic figure confined within his palace walls. Historian Hugh Kennedy, professor of Arabic at SOAS, University of London, captures this transformation succinctly. Under Al-Mansur, the Caliphate transformed from a civilian-oriented empire into a highly militarized state, profoundly altering Andalusian politics and society. Unlike Abd al-Rahman III, whose rule emphasized cultural and administrative sophistication, Al-Mansur saw Cordoba's lavish lifestyle as evidence of decadence and moral corruption. Believing deeply in the ideological power of jihad, religious struggle against non-Muslims, he aimed to purify Al-Andalus by returning it to the austere, militaristic values he idealized from Islam's early expansion. This fundamental shift had dramatic consequences. Historian Maribel Fierro, research professor at the Spanish National Research Council, describes Al-Mansur's radical policy changes. Al-Mansur viewed the elite of Cordoba with suspicion, perceiving their wealth and culture as dangerously corrupting. His remedy was aggressive jihad campaigns aimed at external enemies, primarily the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia. Thus began an era of relentless militarization. Al-Mansur personally led dozens of military campaigns northward into Christian-held territories. His most infamous act occurred in 997 AD, when he sacked the sacred Christian pilgrimage site of Santiago de Compostela, a profoundly symbolic humiliation. The city's cathedral was looted, its bells stripped and carried back to Cordoba by Christian captives who were forced to bear these trophies as symbols of their subjugation. Hugh Kennedy emphasizes the symbolic significance. The sacking of Santiago de Compostela represented not only military conquest, but a calculated psychological attack intended to demoralize Christian Europe. Yet this constant warfare and aggressive jihad created significant internal stresses. To maintain his military machine, Al-Mansur increasingly relied on mercenary soldiers, particularly Berbers from North Africa. While militarily effective, these mercenary forces intensified existing ethnic and social tensions within Al-Andalus. Historian Simon R. Doubleday, professor of history at Hofstra University, notes the deeper implications of Al-Mansur's reliance on Berbers. By bringing in Berber mercenaries, Al-Mansur unknowingly exacerbated the ethnic divisions already simmering within Andalusian society. These tensions would eventually tear Cordoba apart. Indeed, the decision to integrate these Berber soldiers proved a grave miscalculation. Resented by Andalusians who saw them as violent outsiders, consuming resources and exacerbating local taxation, the Berbers increasingly felt alienated and exploited by the Andalusian elite. This mutual suspicion would later explode catastrophically into open conflict after al-Mansur's death. Moreover, al-Mansur's ideological zeal extended beyond external conquests. Internally, he initiated aggressive religious purges, targeting scholars he suspected of heresy. Works deemed controversial were burned publicly, and dissident intellectuals faced persecution, imprisonment, or even execution. Córdoba's celebrated intellectual freedom and cosmopolitan openness began to give way to a narrower, more intolerant cultural atmosphere. Historian Maria Rosa Menocal, Yale University, acknowledges the stark change brought about by al-Mansur's strict policies. Under al-Mansur, the vibrant intellectual climate of Córdoba became constrained. A new rigidity took hold, threatening the very cultural diversity that had previously defined Andalusi society. Yet paradoxically, despite this internal tightening, al-Mansur's reign marked the peak of Córdoba's territorial expansion. Never had Andalusi armies penetrated so deeply and so frequently into northern Iberia. Militarily, al-Mansur appeared invincible, hence his title, the Victorious. However, his victories carried hidden costs. The militarization of society drained economic resources, eroded social cohesion, and left Al-Andalus exhausted. Al-Mansur's death in 1002 triggered an immediate crisis, as the powerful military apparatus he constructed was too dependent on his personal authority and charisma. His son and successor, Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar, inherited a dangerously unstable regime propped up by force alone. In reflecting upon al-Mansur's legacy, Hugh Kennedy summarizes the historian's debate regarding his ultimate impact on Al-Andalus. Al-Mansur was unquestionably successful as a conqueror, but his militarization ultimately destabilized the entire Caliphate, planting seeds for its rapid fragmentation after his death. Thus, the militarization of Al-Andalus under al-Mansur, though initially appearing strong and successful, inadvertently set the stage for the Caliphate's collapse. The aggressive pursuit of jihad, combined with internal ethnic tensions and authoritarian control, pushed Córdoba's society to the brink. When the charismatic warrior died, the carefully balanced yet fragile political structure unraveled rapidly, leading to civil war, internal violence, and the catastrophic fragmentation of Andalusia into vulnerable Taifa kingdoms. What al-Mansur intended as purification instead ushered in an era of chaos and violence, permanently ending Córdoba's golden age and paving the way for the Christian Reconquista that would forever alter Europe's history. The death of al-Mansur in 1002 left Al-Andalus powerful yet dangerously unstable. His militarized state had depended on the force of his personality, leaving no lasting institutional stability. After his passing, power passed to his son Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar, who despite his own military successes was less capable politically and increasingly dependent on mercenaries and factional alliances. Upon Abd al-Malik's death in 1008, the Caliphate descended into a power struggle marked by bitter ethnic rivalries, palace intrigues, and ultimately civil war, the fitna. The pivotal figure in these chaotic events was Muhammad ibn Abi Amir, known contemptuously by contemporaries as Sanchuelo, a nickname referencing his Christian ancestry, underscoring the deeply entrenched ethnic prejudices of Córdoba's society. Sanchuelo's decision to demand that the passive and isolated Caliph Hisham II name him heir further inflamed tensions. His attempts to impose Berber cultural practices, such as wearing distinctive Berber turbans upon the Andalusian elite, ignited a political powder keg. Historian Hugh Kennedy vividly describes this moment of crisis. When Sanchuelo imposed Berber fashions and customs on the Andalusian court, he unleashed latent ethnic hostilities that had been simmering for decades. The resentment exploded when Sanchuelo, absent on military campaign, left Córdoba vulnerable. The Andalusian elite, disgusted by his heavy-handed rule, seized their opportunity. Led by rival Umayyad claimants, the city's citizens rebelled, deposed the figurehead Caliph Hisham II, and brutally executed Sanchuelo upon his return. But the violence did not stop there. The new rulers, eager to solidify their power and motivated by decades of accumulated resentment, turned their anger toward the large Berber community within Córdoba. In a horrific wave of ethnic violence, a bounty was placed on the head of every Berber. Córdoba became a scene of unimaginable carnage. Thousands of Berbers were massacred in the streets, their bodies displayed publicly as warnings. Maribel Fierro, Spanish National Research Council, describes these atrocities as a grim outpouring of pent-up ethnic hatred, noting that women were enslaved and abused, while even pregnant Berber women fell victim to unspeakable brutality. Yet, as is often the case with violence, the massacres triggered immediate repercussions. Berber warriors, outraged by these atrocities, rallied outside the city and returned to exact vengeance. In 1010, Córdoba found itself under siege. A city that had once dazzled the world now brought to its knees. 3 years of starvation, cannibalism, and desperation followed, as historian Simon Doubleday notes with poignant clarity. The siege of Córdoba exposed the fragility beneath its golden exterior. Amid the hunger, disease, and terror, Córdoba's illustrious civilization crumbled, never to fully recover. When Berber forces finally broke through in 1013, Córdoba was brutally sacked, stripped of its treasures and ravaged by violence. Thousands were slaughtered, palaces and libraries burned, and the magnificent city reduced to ashes. Historian Maribel Fierro succinctly summarizes this decisive turning point. The sack of Córdoba was more than just the end of a dynasty. It shattered the symbolic unity that had held Al-Andalus together, plunging the region into permanent division. From this devastation, the Caliphate never recovered. Although nominal Umayyad caliphs continued to be proclaimed, they were mere puppets, powerless figures ruling over empty palaces. Córdoba, once Europe's brightest cultural beacon, rapidly descended into political insignificance. Instead, Al-Andalus splintered into dozens of smaller competing kingdoms known as the Taifa states, each ruled by ambitious local leaders who abandoned any pretense of unity. The fragmentation of the Caliphate had monumental historical consequences. Without centralized power, these Taifa kingdoms were economically prosperous, but politically weak and militarily vulnerable. Christian kingdoms to the north, particularly Castile, Leon, and Aragon, seized the opportunity presented by this vulnerability, initiating an aggressive and relentless campaign of reconquest, known today as the Reconquista. Hugh Kennedy highlights this historical shift clearly. The Fitna marked the true beginning of the Reconquista. Al-Andalus's fragmentation directly enabled Christian kingdoms to expand southward, reshaping the medieval geopolitical map of Europe. From this point forward, the history of Iberia became a story of gradual yet relentless Christian advance, driven both by religious zeal and political opportunism. The consequences extended far beyond Iberia's borders, impacting European identity, cultural boundaries, and the rise of nation-states, ultimately laying the foundations for modern Europe's religious, cultural, and political divisions. Thus, the Fitna was more than just civil war. It represented a critical pivot in European history. The destruction of Córdoba's central authority and its resulting fragmentation shaped centuries of conflict, ultimately driving historical currents that reached far beyond the Iberian Peninsula, currents whose influence can still be felt today. The dramatic rise and catastrophic collapse of Al-Andalus profoundly reshaped Europe's historical trajectory. At its height, Cordoba had stood as the cultural and intellectual heart of medieval Europe, radiating influence far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Yet its violent fall and the subsequent fragmentation into competing Taifa kingdoms signaled a historic turning point, unleashing forces that would permanently alter Europe's destiny. Historian Maria Rosa Menocal, Yale University, succinctly captures Al-Andalus's enduring cultural significance. The civilization of Al-Andalus was more than just an exotic interlude in European history. It served as a crucial bridge linking the classical world to medieval and early modern Europe, transmitting knowledge, science, and philosophy that profoundly shaped Europe's intellectual rebirth. Indeed, the scientific and cultural achievements of Andalusi society, spanning astronomy, mathematics, medicine, architecture, and literature, were pivotal in facilitating the Renaissance that would eventually flourish centuries later. Al-Andalus preserved and expanded upon Greek, Persian, and Roman knowledge, introducing sophisticated agricultural techniques, urban planning methods, and administrative structures that profoundly influenced European states emerging in its aftermath. Yet the legacy of Al-Andalus extends far beyond cultural and intellectual influences alone. Its political fragmentation following the brutal Fitna Wars radically reshaped Iberian geopolitics. Historian Hugh Kennedy, professor of Arabic at SOAS, University of London, emphasizes this shift clearly. The collapse of the Caliphate transformed Al-Andalus from a unified political entity into a collection of vulnerable, competing Taifa states. This vulnerability directly empowered the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia, catalyzing their southward expansion and initiating the historical process we know today as the Reconquista. The Reconquista, fueled by religious fervor and political ambition, fundamentally altered Europe's identity. It solidified a militant Christianity, establishing clear and permanent cultural and religious boundaries between the Christian North and the Muslim South. This process laid the groundwork for the emergence of powerful European kingdoms, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and later Portugal, whose eventual unification into nation-states profoundly influenced European and global history. Moreover, the Reconquista directly spurred further European expansionism beyond Iberia itself. Simon R. Doubleday, professor of history at Hofstra University, describes this process vividly. The Christian conquest of Al-Andalus not only redrew the map of Iberia, it also set the stage for European colonialism. The ambitions, skills, and ideologies developed in Iberia's Reconquista were soon applied beyond Europe's shores, launching an era of global exploration, conquest, and empire. Indeed, the experience gained during the centuries-long Reconquista, militarily, culturally, and politically, provided invaluable lessons to Iberian kingdoms, which, immediately after reclaiming their territory, embarked upon voyages of discovery and conquest across the Atlantic. Thus, the story of Al-Andalus and its fall is deeply interconnected with the birth of Europe's global colonial empires. Historiographical debates surrounding Al-Andalus further illustrate its complexity. While some historians, such as Menocal, emphasize its coexistence and cultural exchange as lessons for modern multicultural societies, others, like Doubleday, caution against idealizing its complexities. Doubleday emphasizes the nuanced realities. Al-Andalus teaches us that multicultural coexistence, while possible and productive, inevitably occurs within power dynamics. Understanding its successes and failures allows us to appreciate both its potential and limitations. Ultimately, Al-Andalus's enduring legacy lies precisely in its complexity. It reveals the profound historical tensions between tolerance and domination, unity and fragmentation, coexistence and conflict. As Menocal poetically reflects, the lost civilization of Al-Andalus forces us to confront history's nuances. It reminds us that the past, like the present, defies easy categorization. Its true legacy is perhaps this very complexity, an enduring reminder that civilizations flourish best when they embrace diversity while navigating its inevitable tensions. Today, the echoes of Al-Andalus continue to resonate in Europe's cultural imagination, political boundaries, and collective memory. Its story remains a potent symbol of both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in cultural and political coexistence. As modern Europe continues grappling with cultural diversity, religious tensions, and shifting geopolitical identities, the lessons of Al-Andalus remain strikingly relevant. Thus, while the physical monuments of Cordoba's golden age may lie largely in ruins, the intellectual and cultural bridges it built and the geopolitical consequences of its fall continue shaping European civilization, reminding us that history is never simply about the past, but always about understanding our complex present and informing our uncertain future. If you've enjoyed this exploration into the rise and fall of Al-Andalus and how it shaped Europe's history, don't stop here. Dive deeper into the extraordinary story of Islam's historical journey by watching our other carefully crafted videos. Explore the early origins of Islam, follow the rapid expansion of the first caliphates, and witness the dramatic battles, legendary cities, and intellectual revolutions that defined an era. Our series on the history of Islam provides nuanced, accurate, and captivating insights into one of history's greatest civilizations. Click on the links provided, subscribe to our channel, and continue discovering how Islam has profoundly shaped our world, yesterday and today. For centuries, the armies of Al-Andalus ruled Iberia, their banners flying high over ancient Roman cities, their scholars and merchants reshaping the land. The great caliphs of Cordoba presided over Europe's wealthiest and most advanced civilization. Yet, in the remote mountains of the north, an ember still burned. The last remnants of the Christian Visigoths, scattered and leaderless, were about to strike back. And so began an 8th century war that would define the fate of a continent. This is Reconquista. When the Western Roman Empire fell, it was the Visigoths, a people who had once been nearly enslaved by Rome, who settled in Spain and established their own kingdom. Unlike the Romans, their rule did not bring economic prosperity. Infrastructure collapsed, the economy shrank to subsistence levels, and cities fell into decline, as pointed Thomas Glick, American historian, in his book Islamic and Christian Spain in the Early Middle Ages, which presents comparative history of the Islamic and Christian areas of Spain in the period between AD 711 and 1250, when these areas emerged as distinct political, social, and cultural entities. But the Visigoths still ruled in the early 8th century when a disastrous civil war happened. In 711 AD, an army led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. At the Battle of Guadalete, place unknown today, King Roderick of the Visigoths was betrayed by his own vassals. His army was annihilated, and Visigothic Spain collapsed almost overnight. Within just 10 years, almost all of Iberia was under Muslim rule, incorporated into the powerful Umayyad Caliphate. To the new Muslim rulers, Iberia, now called Al-Andalus, was a paradise. Historian Brian A. Catlos, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, writes that aside from the rainy, mountainous fringe of the north, Iberia's geography bore a strong resemblance to North Africa and the Middle East, fertile, sun-baked, and primed for agricultural wealth. However, in the mountains of Asturias, Christian resistance was stirring. In 718 AD, or 722 AD, according to some sources, a Visigothic noble named Pelayo made a desperate stand at the Battle of Covadonga. Though vastly outnumbered, his small band of warriors used the treacherous mountain terrain to their advantage, inflicting a stunning defeat on a Muslim force. Historians debate the historical accuracy of Covadonga, as Muslim sources don't even mention it. But as Joseph F. O'Callaghan, Professor Emeritus of Medieval History and former Director of the Center for Medieval Studies at Fordham University, and one of the leading historians for the period, puts it in his book, Reconquest and Crusade in Medieval Spain, whether exaggerated in Christian memory or not, Covadonga was the first spark of resistance, proof that the Muslim conquest was not absolute. From Asturias, the seeds of the Christian Reconquista were planted. For over 2 centuries after Pelayo's victory at Covadonga, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia did not thrive, they merely survived. The reality of the early Reconquista was not one of rapid Christian expansion, but of small, isolated kingdoms clinging to existence in the mountainous north. Muslim Al-Andalus was still the dominant power, economically, culturally, and militarily. Yet, slowly but surely, the foundations of Christian resurgence were laid. This was a period of defensive consolidation, the gradual emergence of Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon, and the beginning of a Christian counter-offensive that would culminate in the fall of Toledo in 1085. The early Christian states were fragmented and weak. Historian Hugh Kennedy, who we extensively cited in our previous videos, emphasizes in his book Muslim Spain and Portugal that Asturias was so isolated and economically backward that it could hardly be considered a kingdom at all. Unlike Al-Andalus, which boasted sophisticated irrigation systems, bustling cities, and a wealthy trade network, Christian Iberia was a rugged, undeveloped frontier. But why did these kingdoms survive? The answer lies in 2 key geographical factors: the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees. These rugged landscapes created natural barriers against Muslim incursions. The Romans had once struggled to control these lands, and now the armies of Al-Andalus found them just as inaccessible and inhospitable. The desert of the Duero, between the Christian kingdoms and Al-Andalus, lay a vast, sparsely populated buffer zone known as the Duero Valley. This was a no-man's land, too dangerous for settled life, but perfect for raiding and guerrilla warfare. The Asturian kings, realizing their precarious position, expanded cautiously, consolidating their hold over the northern strip of Iberia. Under King Alfonso II, r. 791 to 842, Asturias was transformed from a loose collection of warlords into an organized kingdom. He even relocated the capital to Oviedo to strengthen his hold over the region. By the early 10th century, Asturias had evolved into the Kingdom of Leon, its rulers pushing southward into the Duero Valley. Ordoño II of Leon, r. 914 to 924, and Ramiro, the second ruler, 931 to 951, began mounting larger raids into Muslim territory. The first major Christian victory at the Battle of Simancas, 939 AD, the most significant moment of this period was the Battle of Simancas, 939 AD, where King Ramiro II of Leon defeated Caliph Abdurrahman III of Córdoba. This was the first time that a Christian kingdom decisively defeated a major Muslim army on the battlefield. Bernard F. Riley was a pioneering scholar in the modern field of medieval Spanish history. In his book, The Contest of Christian and Muslim Spain, he notes that Simancas shattered the illusion of Muslim invincibility, proving that Christian forces could stand against the power of Córdoba following Simancas. Leon expanded further south, capturing strategic cities like Salamanca and Zamora. But Leon itself was fragile. Internal rivalries and succession crisis weakened the kingdom, leading to a new power emerging from within its own territory: Castile. Originally just a small county on Leon's eastern frontier, Castile was a harsh, lawless land. Its name literally means land of castles, a reference to the countless fortifications built to defend against Muslim and Christian rivals alike. Under Count Fernán González, reigned 931 to 970, Castile began to act independently from Leon. Gonzalez took advantage of Leon's internal struggles, consolidating his control and forging Castile's identity as a militarized, fiercely independent state. By the mid-11th century, Castile had grown in power and would soon become the dominant Christian kingdom. Castile's leaders adopted a more aggressive frontier mentality than Leon, relying on constant warfare and fortification building. The population of Castile grew through repopulation efforts, as Christian settlers were encouraged to move southward. Unlike Leon, Castile's rulers were less tied to Visigothic traditions and more focused on practical military expansion. Historian Richard Fletcher, in his well-known book The Quest for El Cid, argues that Castile's rise was a product of war, where constant border conflicts shaped its militaristic culture. While Leon and Castile fought for supremacy, two other Christian states emerged in the east. Navarre, a kingdom founded by the Basques, fiercely independent and skilled in mountain warfare. It became a key player under Sancho III, the Great, ruled from 1004 to 1035, who expanded Navarre's influence over Leon, Castile, and Aragon. Aragon, originally a small Pyrenean county, Aragon grew under the influence of Navarre. Under Ramiro I, ruled from 1035 to 1063, it became an independent kingdom and slowly expanded southward. The eastern kingdoms benefited from their ties to France, as French knights and nobles frequently assisted them against Muslim forces. This would later become a key factor in the spread of Crusader ideology into the Reconquista. The greatest turning point for the Christian kingdoms came in 1031, when the mighty Caliphate of Córdoba, we covered its history in depth in our last video, link is in description below, collapsed. For centuries, Córdoba had been the undisputed power in Iberia, economically, politically, and militarily. But now, Muslim Spain, fragmented into dozens of rival Taifa kingdoms, each fighting for survival. How did this help the Christians? The Taifa states were militarily weak as they fought amongst themselves. They began paying tribute, parias, to Christian kings in exchange for protection. This influx of Muslim gold helped fund Christian armies and accelerate the Reconquista. Historian Joseph F. O'Callaghan explains that the Christian kings were less concerned with immediate conquest than with making the Taifa rulers their tributaries. This quote was taken from his book, Reconquest and Crusade in Medieval Spain. This led to the most significant conquest yet. In 1085, King Alfonso VI of Castile-Leon captured Toledo, the former Visigothic capital. This was a monumental victory, not just for Castile, but for all of Christian Spain. Toledo was the first major Muslim city to fall into Christian hands. It was a psychological and symbolic turning point, proving that the Reconquista was no longer just about survival. It was now about reclaiming lost lands. Hugh Kennedy, in Muslim Spain and Portugal, describes Toledo's fall as a dagger thrust into the heart of Al-Andalus. However, this success brought unintended consequences. The weak Taifa rulers, desperate for help, called in the Almoravids from North Africa. These were militant Berber warriors who would halt the Christian advance and bring new levels of religious fanaticism to the war. The Reconquista was about to enter its bloodiest phase yet. By the end of the 11th century, the balance of power in Iberia was shifting. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, and Aragon had moved beyond mere survival and had begun aggressively expanding southward, taking advantage of the political fragmentation of Al-Andalus. But this period of Christian dominance would not last. The Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus, facing collapse, called for aid from across the Mediterranean. Their desperate appeal would unleash two of the most powerful North African Islamic dynasties in history, the Almoravids, 11th century, a warrior sect of Berbers who arrived to stop the Christian advance and briefly reunified Muslim Spain. The Almohads, 12th century, an even more radical and powerful movement that would nearly crush the Christian kingdoms before suffering a catastrophic defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. For over 150 years, these fanatical North African dynasties would turn Iberia into one of the fiercest battlegrounds of the medieval world. After the fall of the Caliphate of Córdoba in 1031, Muslim Spain fragmented into dozens of rival Taifa states, each ruled by local kings, emirs. The problem: the Taifas were politically weak and constantly at war with one another. Instead of uniting against the Christians, they often hired Christian mercenaries to fight their Muslim rivals. The solution? Paying off Christian kings. Many Taifa rulers, knowing they couldn't defeat the Christian kingdoms, began paying tribute, parias, to Castile and Leon. These massive payments of gold, silver and luxury goods funded Christian armies, accelerating the Reconquista. Everything changed in 1085, when King Alfonso VI of Castile-Leon captured Toledo, the most important city in central Iberia. Joseph F. O'Callaghan describes Toledo's fall as the first major territorial loss for Muslim Spain since the initial conquest, reconquest and crusade in medieval Spain. Faced with the real possibility of complete Christian domination, the desperate Muslim rulers of Seville, Badajoz and Granada turned to North Africa for help. They invited a powerful Berber dynasty, the Almoravids, to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and defend Islam. Who were the Almoravids? The Almoravids were a Berber warrior sect from the Sahara Desert. They had built a mighty empire across North Africa, stretching from Morocco to Ghana. They followed a strict interpretation of Islam, viewing the Taifa rulers of Al-Andalus as corrupt, weak, and unworthy of rule. Their leader was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, a brilliant general and ruthless ruler. Yusuf and his highly disciplined army of 15,000 Berber warriors landed in Iberia. In October 1086, they met Alfonso IV's Castilian army at the Battle of Sagrajas, also known as Al-Zalaqa, meaning slippery ground. The result was a massacre. The Christian army was annihilated. Hugh Kennedy writes that Sagrajas was a catastrophic defeat, demonstrating that Christian expansion was far from inevitable. Muslim Spain and Portugal. What was the impact of that bloody battle? Christian expansion was stopped in its tracks. The Taifa rulers, though initially grateful, soon realized that the Almoravids were here to stay. In 1090, Yusuf deposed the Taifa rulers and absorbed Al-Andalus into his empire, reunifying Muslim Spain for the first time since Córdoba's fall. At first, the Almoravids stabilized Al-Andalus. They fortified cities, strengthened armies, and brought religious discipline. Among their other achievements were restored Muslim military power in Iberia, prevented further Christian conquests for nearly 50 years, built fortresses and strengthened defenses, turning cities like Seville and Granada into military strongholds. Derek W. Lomax, an important British historian in his book The Reconquest of Spain from 1978, notes that, for a time, the Almoravids re-established Muslim power in Spain, but their harsh rule alienated many Andalusians. However, the Almoravids were not invincible. Over time, their brutal taxation and religious extremism turned the local Muslim population against them. In 1147, a new enemy emerged, the Almohads, an even more radical movement from Morocco. Who were the Almohads? The Almohads were a fundamentalist Islamic movement from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. Unlike the Almoravids, who were strict but pragmatic, the Almohads were zealots. They believed in absolute religious purity, persecuting not only Christians and Jews, but also Muslims they deemed unfaithful. The Battle of Al-Andalus, 1995. Christian defeat. The Almohads invaded Iberia, and in 1995, under Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, they devastated the Castilian army at the Battle of Al-Andalus. Richard Fletcher was a British historian who specialized in the medieval period. In his book, Moorish Spain, he describes Al-Andalus as one of the most humiliating defeats in Castilian history, exposing the fragility of Christian power. What was the impact? Christian advances were reversed. Castile and Aragon suffered heavy losses. The Almohads strengthened their grip on Al-Andalus, imposing strict Islamic rule. By 1200, it seemed like the Reconquista might fail entirely, but the Christian kingdoms would not surrender. A powerful coalition of Christian forces was gathering, leading to one of the most decisive battles in medieval history. By the end of the 12th century, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia were facing their greatest crisis since the early days of the Reconquista. The arrival of the Almohads, a militant North African dynasty, had reversed Christian gains and brought Iberia back under strong Muslim rule. The Battle of Al-Andalus, 1995, had been a catastrophe. Castile suffered a devastating defeat, and the Almohads, under Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, crushed Christian resistance. Many feared that the Almohads, who had reunified Al-Andalus, might finally put an end to Christian rule in Iberia. But instead of surrendering, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre forged an unprecedented alliance. Their leaders turned to Rome, framing the war as a crusade against Islam. The response was overwhelming. Knights from across Europe answered the call, and in 1212, at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, Christian forces delivered a blow from which Muslim Spain would never recover. By the early 13th century, the Almohads ruled one of the largest empires in the Mediterranean. Their empire stretched across North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain. Who were the Almohads? The Almohads were an ultra-conservative Islamic movement that had overthrown the previous rulers of North Africa, the Almoravids, in the 1140s. Unlike the Almoravids, who had ruled with some tolerance, the Almohads enforced a strict version of Islam and viewed both Christians and Jews as infidels who had to be either converted, expelled, or killed. Brian A. Catlos, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, notes, the Almohads saw themselves as religious reformers, tasked with purifying Islam. In doing so, they alienated much of their own population, particularly in Al-Andalus, where Jews and Christians had lived relatively peacefully for centuries. By 1195, under Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, the Almohads had reached the height of their power. After their crushing victory over Castile at Al-Andalus, Christian leaders feared the complete collapse of the Reconquista, but internal struggles were weakening the Almohad state. The Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur died in 1199, leading to succession crises. Almohad rulers were forced to spend more time in North Africa, fighting rebels and keeping control of their vast empire. In Al-Andalus, local Muslims began to resent the Almohads' harsh rule, secretly hoping for Christian intervention. This was the perfect moment for a Christian counterattack. In 1212, King Alfonso VIII of Castile, still recovering from the humiliation of Al-Andalus, sent an urgent request to Pope Innocent III, asking for a crusade against the Almohads. The Pope's response: a papal bull for Iberia. Pope Innocent III declared a holy war against the Almohads, granting the same spiritual rewards given to crusaders fighting in the Holy Land. Christian rulers across Europe were urged to send troops to Iberia. Massive numbers of French Knights Templars and Hospitallers signed up for the campaign. Why was this significant? Before this, the Reconquista had been largely a regional war between Iberian Christians and Muslims. Now it was seen as part of a global struggle, a war as important as the Crusades in Jerusalem. Joseph F. O'Callaghan writes, the Reconquista was no longer just about Iberia. It became part of a broader Christian effort to reclaim all lands lost to Islam. Reconquest and Crusade in medieval Spain. The coalition that formed was one of the largest Christian armies ever assembled in Iberia. Who fought at Las Navas de Tolosa? King Alfonso VIII of Castile, the main leader of the campaign, seeking revenge for Al-Andalus. King Pedro II of Aragon, a powerful ally with strong French support. King Sancho VII of Navarre, a Basque warrior king who would play a key role in the battle. Portuguese and Leonese knights. Though the kings of Leon and Portugal refused to participate, many of their nobles and military orders joined anyway. French and European crusaders. Thousands of knights from France, Italy, and Germany arrived in Castile. Total Christian army size, estimated 50,000 to 60,000 men. Total Almohad army size, estimated 60,000 to 75,000 men. Key difference. The Christian army was unified under one cause, while the Almohads were fighting on multiple fronts, with many of their forces stationed in North Africa. Hugh Kennedy explains, unlike the earlier battles of the Reconquista, Las Navas de Tolosa was a highly coordinated, strategic campaign. The Christian kingdoms had learned from their mistakes, Muslim Spain and Portugal. With their army assembled, the Christians marched south, deep into Almohad territory. The battlefield near Despeñaperros Pass, central Spain. The Almohads had dug defensive trenches and fortified their camp, expecting a long siege. Richard Fletcher writes, the Almohads had chosen their battlefield wisely, blocking the Christians' advance with steep cliffs and rugged terrain, Moorish Spain. Phase 1 of the battle, the Christian attack, begins. Castilian heavy cavalry launched a frontal assault, attempting to break the Almohad lines. Almohad archers and cavalry counterattacked, pushing them back. The battle stalled. It seemed like a repeat of Alarcos. Phase 2. The breakthrough. King Sancho, 7th of Navarre, led a shock assault with his elite troops. They stormed a key fortified hill, breaking through the Almohad defensive walls. Seeing their defenses collapse, the Almohads panicked and retreated. Final outcome, a devastating Almohad defeat. The Christian army destroyed the Almohad forces, killing thousands. The Almohads fled south, abandoning their strongholds in Spain. Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir barely escaped back to Morocco, humiliated. Simon R. Doubleday, in his book The Wise King, describes the battle as the moment where Muslim dominance in Iberia was irreversibly broken. Aftermath. The Reconquista accelerates the results of Christian victory. The Almohads never recovered. Their empire collapsed within 50 years. Córdoba fell in 1236. Valencia fell in 1238. Seville fell in 1248. By 1250, Muslim rule in Iberia was reduced to a single kingdom, Granada. Derek W. Lomax concludes, after Las Navas de Tolosa, the Reconquista was no longer a question of if, but when. The reconquest of Spain. The Christians had broken the back of Muslim Spain. The year 1492 stands as a defining moment in Spanish history. It was the year that marked the culmination of nearly 800 years of struggle between Christians and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. With the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, the Reconquista came to its final conclusion. But this was more than just a military conquest. It was the birth of a united Spain, a moment that reshaped not only Iberia, but also the entire world. The story of Granada's fall is one of war, diplomacy, betrayal, and a kingdom's desperate attempt to hold on to power against an enemy that had become too strong. It is also the story of the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, whose vision for a unified Spain was realized through a decade-long siege that would push the last remnants of Muslim rule off the European mainland. For more than 2 centuries, the Emirate of Granada had survived in the shadow of growing Christian kingdoms. But the forces that had once allowed it to thrive, its wealth, its stronghold in the mountains, and its ability to pay tribute, were no longer enough. By the late 15th century, the world had changed. Christian Europe was on the rise, while the Islamic world was divided and weak. The fall of Granada was no longer a question of if, but when. Granada had not always been the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. 200 years earlier, the Iberian Peninsula was home to many independent Muslim Taifa states. But after the fall of Córdoba in 1236, Valencia in 1238, and Seville in 1248, Muslim rule had been reduced to a single kingdom, the Emirate of Granada. Ruled by the Nasrid dynasty, Granada had managed to survive through a combination of political cunning, economic strength, and military defense. The Sierra Nevada mountains provided a natural barrier against Christian armies, while the Alhambra, the stunning palace fortress that dominated the city, stood as a symbol of Muslim power in Spain. But above all, Granada survived because it played the game of diplomacy well. Its rulers had for centuries paid tribute, parias, to the Christian kingdoms, offering gold, silk, and luxury goods in exchange for peace. This wealth allowed Granada to maintain a lavish court culture filled with poets, architects, and scholars at a time when the Christian kingdoms were still forging their identities. Brian A. Catlos notes, Granada was not just a political entity. It was a cultural masterpiece, a fusion of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions that had flourished in Iberia for centuries, kingdoms of faith. But this fragile existence could not last forever. By the late 15th century, the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Christians, and the rulers of Granada knew it. The final blow to Granada came not just from superior military power, but from a political marriage that changed the course of history. In 1469, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon were married, uniting the two most powerful Christian kingdoms in Spain. Before their reign, Christian Iberia had been divided, with different kingdoms often fighting one another instead of focusing on the Muslim enemy to the south. But with this marriage, Spain became a single, unified entity, determined to complete the Reconquista. Joseph F. O'Callaghan writes, "The union of Castile and Aragon was more than a political alliance. It was the birth of a new Spain, one that saw itself as the champion of Christendom, reconquest, and crusade in medieval Spain." For Isabella and Ferdinand, the conquest of Granada was not just a military goal, it was a divine mission. They framed their war against the Nasrids as a holy crusade, a final push to remove Islam from Spain once and for all. They refused to continue the traditional system of allowing Granada to pay tribute in exchange for peace. Instead, they made it clear, Granada must surrender or be destroyed. The war began in 1482. Unlike previous campaigns, this was not a series of isolated raids, but a coordinated military effort that involved thousands of troops, the latest siege technology, and the full backing of the Catholic Church. The war unfolded in three key phases. Phase 1, the Christian advance, 1482 to 1487. The Catholic monarchs began their campaign by capturing key fortresses surrounding Granada. Their first major victory came in 1486, when they took Loja, a crucial defensive outpost. But the biggest blow came in 1487, when the Christians besieged Malaga, Granada's most important Mediterranean port. After months of brutal fighting, Malaga fell, cutting off the Nasrids from their supply routes to North Africa. Hugh Kennedy explains, "With the loss of Malaga, Granada's fate was sealed. Without access to the sea, it could no longer sustain itself for long, Muslim Spain and Portugal." Phase 2, the Siege of Baza, 1489. Baza, another major Nasrid stronghold, fell after an 8-month siege in 1489. With this victory, Ferdinand and Isabella had isolated Granada, leaving it as the last Muslim city in Spain. Phase 3, the final siege of Granada, 1491 to 1492. In late 1491, the Christian army surrounded Granada itself. The siege was merciless. The Catholic monarchs built an entire town, Santa Fe, outside the city walls, ensuring a permanent military presence. Richard Fletcher describes the siege as a war of patience. Ferdinand and Isabella knew that Granada could not hold out forever. Moorish Spain. By December 1491, Emir Muhammad XII, Boabdil, saw no way out. His city was starving and his people were losing faith. He surrendered on January 2nd, 1492, handing over the keys to the city. According to legend, as he rode away from Granada, Boabdil wept, prompting his mother to say, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The consequences of Granada's fall, the end of Islamic rule in Spain. After 781 years, Muslim rule in Iberia was over. The expulsion of Jews and Muslims. In 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra decree, forcing all Jews to convert or leave Spain. In 1502, the same fate awaited Muslims. The Spanish Inquisition begins, a tool used to ensure religious purity in Spain, targeting suspected heretics. The Age of Exploration. Just months after Granada's fall, Christopher Columbus set sail, leading to Spain's rise as a global superpower. Derek Lomax writes, 1492 was the moment when Spain emerged as a world empire, fueled by the conquest of Granada and the discovery of the New World, the reconquest of Spain. The Reconquista was more than just a war. It was a struggle for identity, power, and the future of Spain. The fall of Granada ended one of the longest conflicts in world history, shaping the religious, political, and cultural trajectory of Iberia for centuries to come. Brian A. Catlos states, "The Reconquista was not just the end of Muslim Spain, it was the beginning of a new global Spain, kingdoms of faith." With Granada's fall, Spain turned its eyes to the Atlantic. The war for Iberia was over. For centuries, the Reconquista has been portrayed as a heroic and righteous struggle between the Christian kingdoms of Iberia and the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus, a grand, centuries-long crusade in which the forces of Christendom pushed back the armies of Islam. But was it truly a holy war? Did the kings of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Portugal genuinely see themselves as warriors of faith, fighting to reclaim Spain for Christianity? Or was the Reconquista primarily a dynastic and territorial conflict, where religion was used as a convenient justification for warfare, conquest, and expansion? This question has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue that the Reconquista was an extension of the Crusades, a divinely sanctioned war to expel Islam from Iberia. Others suggest that it was a much more complex process, shaped by political ambitions, shifting alliances, and the practical realities of medieval power struggles. To understand the true nature of the Reconquista, we must examine how religion shaped both Christian and Muslim narratives, how the Church and the papacy influenced the wars, and whether the rhetoric of crusade matched the reality of war on the ground. The Christian rulers of Iberia certainly framed the Reconquista in religious terms. From the early chronicles of the 9th and 10th centuries, Christian kings were portrayed as defenders of the faith, striving to restore a land that had been lost to Muslim invaders. This idea was particularly powerful in Castile and Leon, where the memory of the Visigothic kingdom, overthrown in 711, lingered in historical writings. Joseph F. O'Callaghan explains, Christian kings and chroniclers consciously shaped the narrative of the Reconquista as a struggle between the forces of Christ and the forces of Islam. They depicted the kings of Leon and Castile as successors to the Visigoths, the rightful heirs to Spain, and the Muslim rulers as usurpers, reconquest and crusade in medieval Spain. This idea of the Reconquista as a restoration rather than a conquest became central to the Christian identity in medieval Spain. In their view, Spain was not being conquered from the Muslims, but reclaimed. However, despite this religious rhetoric, many Christian rulers were just as willing to make alliances with Muslim leaders when it suited their needs. Kings of Leon and Castile often accepted tribute, Parias, from Muslim Taifa rulers, taking gold in exchange for peace. At times, they even hired Muslim soldiers to fight against their Christian rivals. Hugh Kennedy argues the reality of medieval Iberia was far more complex than a simple Christian-Muslim struggle. Alliances frequently crossed religious lines. Christian kings were willing to fight alongside Muslim rulers when it benefited them, just as Muslim emirs sometimes allied with Christian kings against other Muslims, Muslim Spain and Portugal. This suggests that while religion was important, it was not the sole driving force behind the Reconquista. The wars were just as much about political power, territorial expansion, and economic gain as they were about faith. The Pope and the Catholic Church played a crucial role in shaping the idea of the Reconquista as a holy war. The earliest religious justifications for the war emerged in the 11th century, when Pope Alexander II granted the first Crusader indulgences for Christian knights fighting in Spain. The turning point came in 1095, when Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Around the same time, he extended the idea of crusade to Iberia, encouraging knights from across Europe to join the war against Al-Andalus. Derek Lomax describes this shift. From the late 11th century onwards, the language of crusade became intertwined with the Reconquista. Christian rulers in Spain increasingly presented their wars as part of the larger struggle against Islam, aligning themselves with the crusading movement, the reconquest of Spain. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy granted full crusader status to warriors who fought in Spain. Just like those who fought in Jerusalem, knights who joined the Reconquista received spiritual rewards, forgiveness of sins, papal protection, and even guarantees of eternal salvation. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 was the peak of this crusading fervour. Pope Innocent III formally declared it a holy war, and knights from France, Italy and Germany joined the campaign. Richard Fletcher states, "The victory at Las Navas de Tolosa was not just a military triumph, but a religious one. It was seen as proof that God had willed the Reconquista to succeed." Moorish Spain. However, while the Church promoted the idea of crusade, this does not mean that all Christian kings saw themselves as purely religious warriors. They accepted papal support when it was useful, but they were ultimately driven by their own ambitions. In the 13th century, after Castile and Aragon had conquered most of Muslim Spain, the Pope wanted them to continue their crusade into North Africa. They refused. This suggests that once their political goals had been met, the crusading cause lost its appeal. While Christian rulers saw the Reconquista as a divinely ordained mission, how did the Muslim rulers of Al-Andalus view the conflict? For much of the early Reconquista, Muslim chroniclers did not see Christian advances as a religious war, but rather as a continuation of political struggles that had existed since the fall of the Caliphate of Córdoba. Taifa rulers were often more concerned with fighting other Muslim rulers than with resisting Christian attacks. However, this changed with the arrival of the Almoravids in the 11th century and the Almohads in the 12th century. These North African dynasties framed their wars in Spain as a jihad, a religious struggle against Christian forces. Simon R. Doubleday writes, "The Almoravids and Almohads brought a new sense of religious purpose to Al-Andalus. They portrayed the Christian advances as an existential threat to Islam itself and called upon all Muslims to resist in the name of faith." The wise king. This shift in perspective meant that by the 12th and 13th centuries, both sides, Christian and Muslim, were using the language of holy war. The Reconquista had become not just a political struggle, but also a deeply ideological one. So was the Reconquista a holy war? The answer is not simple. On one hand, religion was an essential part of the ideology of the war. Christian rulers used the rhetoric of crusade to justify their expansion, while Muslim leaders invoked jihad to resist them. The papacy granted indulgences, and knights from across Europe joined the fight. But on the other hand, the reality of the Reconquista was far more complex than a simple Christian versus Muslim struggle. Political ambition, economic motivations, and shifting alliances played just as large a role as religious faith. Brian A. Catlos summarizes, "The Reconquista was neither a pure holy war nor a purely political conflict. It was a centuries-long struggle in which faith and power were inseparably intertwined, shaping the destiny of Spain and the world beyond. Kingdoms of faith." Ultimately, the Reconquista was both a war of faith and a war of empire, a war where religious ideals and earthly ambitions were fused into one. The Reconquista was a war of faith, power, and identity, shaping not just Spain but the entire medieval world. It was a story of alliances and betrayals, triumphs and defeats, shaping the destiny of Iberia for centuries. But this is just one chapter in the larger saga of medieval history. Subscribe for more. If you love epic medieval history, deep dive storytelling, and historically accurate analysis, then make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Join the discussion. What do you think? Was the Reconquista truly a holy war, or was it more about power and politics? Let us know in the comments below. We read and respond to as many as we can. Like and share. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like the video and share it with fellow history enthusiasts. The more people join our journey, the better. History is more than just facts. It's the story of us all. Let's keep discovering it together. They began as forgotten raiders on the edge of a dying empire. Within 150 years, they would shake the world. In the shadow of shattered empires, as Mongol thunder echoed across the east and Byzantium clung to fading glory, a new power stirred in the forgotten frontiers of Anatolia. This is the story of a people without a past. Nomads and raiders, outcasts and warriors, who carved their future with the sword and the word. From the smouldering ruins of the Seljuks and the crumbling walls of Constantinople, the Ottoman Beylik emerged, small, obscure, yet unstoppable. In a world ruled by warlords and fractured faiths, they offered more than conquest. They promised order, vision, and destiny. Through fire and blood, the Ottomans expanded, devouring cities and breaking kingdoms, not as mere raiders, but as architects of empire. As Byzantine emperors made desperate pacts, as Balkan kings fell one by one, a young sultan prepared for the moment that would change history forever. The conquest of Constantinople is still distant, but its storm is already building. Before Mehmed the Conqueror rises, before the imperial banners fly over 3 continents, we must understand the centuries that shaped them. This is not just the story of a dynasty, it is the forging of an empire, from dust, from faith, from ambition. This is the Ottoman rise. Before the Ottomans ever raised a banner, Anatolia was already on fire. Empires had fallen, warlords ruled, and the road to power was paved with ash. But in this chaos, a new force would soon rise. In the final decades of the 13th century, the land that would later become the heart of the Ottoman Empire bore little resemblance to a unified state. Western Anatolia was not a cradle of empire. It was a battleground of fragmented principalities, competing warbands, and decaying imperial legacies. Following the catastrophic Battle of Kosadar in 1243, the once dominant Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was shattered by the Mongol advance. With their power broken and Mongol overlords asserting control through the Ilkhanate, a power vacuum emerged across the Anatolian plateau. This vacuum, exacerbated by the declining influence of the Byzantine Empire after the reconquest of Constantinople in 1261, allowed for the rise of a series of small Turkish-led principalities known as beyliks. According to Professor Heath Lowry of Princeton University, Anatolia in the late 13th century resembled the Iberian taifas of Muslim Spain, fractured, dynamic, and ruled by local power brokers whose legitimacy was derived from personal charisma and military success rather than institutional stability. These beyliks were not fully sovereign entities. They existed under nominal Mongol suzerainty, and the coins minted during this period typically bore the names of Ilkhanid rulers, not local leaders. Yet in practice, these frontier lords wielded real authority, militarily, economically, and spiritually over their regions. They commanded loyalty not through written law, but through martial prowess and religious legitimacy, often positioning themselves as champions of the Gaza, the struggle against non-Muslim enemies. This chaotic mosaic of Anatolia was both volatile and opportunistic. Byzantine fortresses dotted the western hills, often under-defended and economically hollow. Christian settlements, Turkish nomads, dervish orders, and retired Seljuk military elites all coexisted, often uneasily, in a landscape marked by fluid borders and transient loyalties. Amid this disarray, one minor principality, initially indistinguishable from the rest, began to take root around the town of Soyut, located in the borderlands of Byzantine Bithynia. Its leader, Osman, remains an elusive figure. No contemporary documents survive from his reign, and what little we know is filtered through later Ottoman chronicles, written generations after his death. Osman left no writings, no grand declarations, but he minted his own coins. That one act signaled the birth of a state. The origin stories surrounding Osman are themselves shrouded in ambiguity. Some claim his lineage stems from a Turkic tribe fleeing the Mongols in Central Asia. Others see him as a local warlord who leveraged Byzantine instability. Historian Colin Imber cautions, "Any attempt to extract facts from the legends of Osman is doomed to speculation. But what is clear is that he created a political structure capable of lasting well beyond his lifetime." Osman's Beylik was not defined by blood ties alone. It was a coalition of tribal nomads, religious figures, and local converts. The early Ottoman enterprise was strikingly inclusive. Byzantine defectors such as Kose Mihal, a Greek Christian who converted to Islam and became one of Osman's closest companions, played essential roles in the early military campaigns. Another key figure, Hranislav, was of Bulgarian origin. These men and their families did not simply fight for Osman, they became Ottoman. Caroline Finkel is a British historian and writer based in Turkey. She has a doctorate in Ottoman history from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. In her book, Osman's Dream, from 2005, she writes, "What set the early Ottomans apart was not just their military success, but their capacity to absorb and unite disparate communities under a shared political vision. The ideological glue that held this nascent community together was the ideal of Gaza, or religious warfare against infidels. This concept, though later exaggerated into a central pillar of Ottoman identity, served a useful ideological function in the early period. As Halil Inalcik explained, the ideal of Gaza, holy war, was an important factor in the foundation and development of the Ottoman state, imbued with the ideal of continuous expansion of the Dar al-Islam. But modern historians are more cautious. The so-called Gaza thesis, championed by Austrian historian Paul Wittek in 1938, once dominated academic thinking. He argued that early Ottoman expansion was driven by a deeply religious fervor. Today, however, scholars like Rudy Paul Lindner and Linda Darling argue that Gaza was just one among many motives. Far from being holy warriors, early Ottoman leaders operated with pragmatic alliances, economic ambitions, and political opportunism. Indeed, economic incentives, particularly access to land and plunder, were perhaps more immediate motivations for the warriors who flocked to Osman's banner. These included Akinch's raiders, whose main purpose was to harass and weaken neighboring Byzantine strongholds. The Ottomans' strategic positioning along the Byzantine border meant that they could direct their campaigns westward, avoiding direct confrontation with stronger Turkish rivals further east. The fluidity of the frontier enabled Osman's principality to act with relative freedom. The Byzantines, weakened by internal strife and imperial overreach, were ill-equipped to respond to constant raids. Towns like Bursa and Nicaea became vulnerable. The first of these, Bursa, would eventually fall not by storm, but by starvation and blockade. By the time of Osman's death in 1323/4, the Ottoman polity remained small, but its foundation was secure. His son, Orhan, would go on to consolidate these early gains, expanding into Byzantine territory, creating formal administrative structures and minting coins in his own name. But the ideological and structural DNA of the Ottoman state had already been set. In a land torn apart by Mongol conquest and Byzantine decline, Osman forged a new order. But it would be Orhan, his son, who would prove that this new state could survive and grow. They were once frontier raiders, a marginal beylik clinging to the edges of a crumbling empire. But under Orhan, son of Osman, the Ottomans would take their first irreversible step toward empire. This is the chapter where opportunism turns to statecraft and a local principality becomes a regional power. When Osman died around 1323 or 24, he left behind a fragile state with no written administration, no siege capabilities, and little to distinguish it from other Anatolian beyliks. His son Orhan would be the first to transform the Ottoman polity into something more permanent. Historian Caroline Finkel describes this pivotal transition as the moment when the Ottomans went from being a tribal enterprise to a nascent state with imperial ambitions. The reign of Orhan thus marks the Ottomans' first attempt at building institutions, consolidating conquests, and expanding beyond Anatolia. Orhan's first challenge was to secure the region of Bithynia, a formerly Byzantine province that was becoming increasingly Turkified due to demographic and military pressure. The Ottomans, operating from their stronghold in Söğüt, had long harassed the region through raids, but it was Orhan who introduced a more strategic approach to conquest. The fall of Bursa in 1326, after a prolonged siege begun under Osman, was a turning point. Bursa became the new capital and symbolized Ottoman permanence. Historian Halil İnalcık asserts that the conquest of Bursa allowed the Ottomans to shift from tribal raids to urban governance, from booty to taxation. By establishing a seat of government in an urban center, Orhan laid the groundwork for a more enduring state structure. The construction of mosques, markets, and administrative buildings followed, signaling an emerging civic identity. To manage his growing domain, Orhan turned to the Seljuk model. He imported Persian-speaking bureaucrats from eastern Anatolia, who brought with them administrative and legal traditions that had matured under the Seljuks of Rum. The first Ottoman madrasa, Islamic college, was founded in Iznik in 1331, marking a significant milestone in cultural and educational development. The historian Cemal Kafadar notes, "With the arrival of scholars and judges from the East, the Ottomans began to craft a distinct synthesis of nomadic Turkic customs and urban Islamic governance. This synthesis would become a hallmark of early Ottoman flexibility, a trait that allowed them to absorb and govern diverse populations." The shift from tribal leadership to centralized administration was gradual but deliberate. Orhan began minting coins in his own name, an act of sovereignty that previous Turkish beys had avoided, preferring to acknowledge the nominal authority of the Ilkhanate. In this, Orhan asserted not only independence, but also legitimacy. Though still reliant on tribal warriors, Orhan expanded the military foundation of the state. The term Ghazi, a warrior for the faith, was increasingly used to define the Ottoman mission, though, as Paul Wittek famously argued in his Gaza thesis, this was as much a legitimizing ideology as a reflection of reality. Wittek wrote, "The early Ottoman state was, in essence, a Ghazi principality, a polity bound together by the ideology of Islamic conquest." While this theory has since been nuanced by scholars such as Heath Lowry and Cemal Kafadar, the concept of Gaza undoubtedly played a role in attracting warriors from both Muslim and Christian backgrounds. It served as a flexible ideological umbrella under which Orhan could unite disparate groups. Orhan's military conquests continued with the capture of key Byzantine cities, including Nicaea, Iznik in 1331, and Nicomedia, Izmit in 1337. These conquests gave the Ottomans control over vital communication routes and trade centers in northwestern Anatolia. Orhan's most consequential Anatolian conquest was that of the neighboring beylik of Karesi in 1345–46. Unlike the rural, loosely organized Ottoman domain, Karesi possessed a seasoned military and a naval force based near the Dardanelles. Its absorption gave Orhan command of the western approaches to the Sea of Marmara and the crossing points into Europe. With Karesi's warriors integrated into the Ottoman army, Orhan stood poised to move into the Balkans. This was more than mere territorial acquisition. It was a geostrategic transformation. Historian Heath Lowry has argued that the conquest of Caresi provided the Ottomans not only with a seasoned Ghazi corps, but with the critical logistical capability for European campaigns. In 1346, Orhan solidified Ottoman-Byzantine relations by marrying Theodora, daughter of the Byzantine regent John VI Cantacuzene. This was not merely a symbolic union, it served tangible military and political goals. In 1352, John VI called on Orhan for aid during a Byzantine civil war, allowing Ottoman troops to enter Europe for the first time. Their reward was the fortress of Chimpe on the Gallipoli Peninsula. This foothold would soon prove decisive. In 1354, an earthquake devastated the Byzantine fortifications in Gallipoli. Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, swiftly occupied the ruined fortresses, beginning the permanent Ottoman presence in Europe. The Byzantines protested, but to no avail. As Donald Quatayat succinctly puts it, Gallipoli marked the point of no return. The Ottomans were now a transcontinental state. Orhan's success also lay in his ability to integrate non-Turkish, non-Muslim populations into his realm. His court included Christian converts such as Köse Mihal, a former Byzantine official who became a prominent Ottoman commander. These alliances were based not on ethnic or religious solidarity, but on political loyalty and shared interest in military success. Marcus Koller observes, the early Ottoman polity functioned more like a frontier confederation than a rigid Islamic state. It absorbed Christians, Greeks, and Slavs as easily as it did Muslim Turks. By the time of Orhan's death in 1362, the Ottomans were no longer just one of many Anatolian beyliks. They had established a durable capital, developed rudimentary institutions, and begun to reshape the political map of Southeast Europe. While his father, Osman, gave his name to the dynasty, it was Orhan who laid the foundations for empire. His reign was not marked by dramatic battles or sweeping reforms, but by patient state-building, tactical marriages, and calculated military campaigns. As Halil Inalcik reminds us, the genius of the early Ottoman rulers was not in conquest alone, but in their ability to consolidate and integrate. In the next chapter, we will examine how Murad I built upon Orhan's legacy, expanding deep into the Balkans, centralizing state power, and transforming the Ottoman Principality into a formidable sultanate poised for global significance. What turned a minor Anatolian principality into a European empire? The answer lies in a transformation during the reign of Murad I, a transformation marked by centralization, militarization, and a decisive confrontation on the Balkan plains. Kosovo was not merely a battle. It was a signal to Europe that the Ottomans were no longer a frontier state, but a rising imperial force. In the mid-14th century, the Ottoman polity underwent a fundamental transformation. Under the rule of Sultan Murad, the first who ruled from 1362 to 1389, the dynasty shifted from a loosely organized principality into a centralized and expansionist regime. This transformation was neither immediate nor inevitable. It was shaped by the internal restructuring of the state and the strategic exploitation of the disintegration of Balkan powers. Born the son of Orhan, Murad ascended the throne at a time of both promise and peril. The Turkish beyliks of Anatolia were still a threat to Ottoman cohesion, and in Europe, the collapse of the Serbian Empire after the death of Stefan Dusan had created a power vacuum. Murad seized upon this chaos and turned it into opportunity. As historian Halil Inalcik notes, Murad was not merely a military leader, he was the architect of Ottoman statehood. A central part of Murad's legacy lies in his administrative reforms. He moved the capital from Bursa to Edirne, Adrianople, a symbolic and strategic relocation that emphasized the Ottoman shift toward the Balkans. Edirne became not only a military hub, but a seat of governance. The court bureaucracy expanded, and the system of taimar, land grants in exchange for military service, was formalized into a pillar of state military organization. Yet, Perhaps Murad's most consequential innovation was the institutionalization of the Janissary Corps. Formed initially as a palace guard, the Janissaries, Yenicheri, quickly evolved into the backbone of the Ottoman infantry. Recruited through the Devshirme system, Christian boys from the Balkans were taken, converted to Islam, and subjected to a rigorous military and ideological training. Far from an act of mere coercion, this system embedded the empire's authority into the households and hearts of conquered populations. As Caroline Finkel writes, the Janissaries represented the Sultan's monopoly on violence. Loyal only to him, they were the sharp edge of a centralized state. Their discipline and loyalty allowed Murad to reduce his reliance on tribal contingents and forge a standing force that mirrored his vision of unity and permanence. Militarily, Murad extended Ottoman power deep into the Balkans. His early campaigns targeted Byzantine remnants in Thrace, followed by incursions into Bulgaria and Macedonia. A critical turning point came with the defeat of a Balkan coalition at the Battle of Maritsa in 1371. The Serbian nobility, weakened and fragmented after Dushan's empire, was no match for the disciplined Ottoman forces. The death of King Vukašin and the subsequent fragmentation of Serbian principalities left the region open to further Ottoman advances. But the ultimate crucible of Murad's reign was the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a battle that has become both historical event and national myth. Prince Lazar of Serbia had assembled a coalition of Slavic forces in a final attempt to halt the Ottoman advance. Murad, aware of the stakes, personally led his army north from Edirne to face them. The battle itself remains shrouded in conflicting accounts, but the outcome was clear, a bloody stalemate that favoured the Ottomans. Prince Lazar was captured and executed. Murad, however, did not live to see the aftermath. According to the Ottoman chronicle of Ashik Pashazadeh, Murad was assassinated in the aftermath of the battle by a Serbian nobleman, Miloš Obilić, a story later romanticized and embedded in Serbian epic tradition. The death of a reigning sultan on the battlefield was unprecedented, yet it did not destabilize the Ottoman state. His son, Bayezid, acted swiftly, executing his brother Yaqub to secure the succession and earning the sobriquet Yildirim, the thunderbolt. This ruthless act underscores a crucial reality of Ottoman dynastic politics. Fratricide was a functional, if brutal, tool of political stability. Historian Mark Mazower captures the significance of Kosovo. It was a moment of transition, the end of Balkan autonomy and the birth of Ottoman imperial dominance in Europe. The battle symbolized both the depth of Ottoman ambition and the resilience of its structures under crisis. Culturally and religiously, Murad's reign was also significant. He presented himself as Ghazi Sultan, the holy warrior of Islam, appealing to the frontier ideology that had long defined Anatolian beyliks. Yet he also adopted elements of Byzantine imperial tradition and encouraged architectural patronage in conquered lands. This dual identity, Turkish Muslim conqueror and imperial ruler over Christians, was to define the Ottoman self-conception for centuries. Murad's legacy is thus twofold. On one hand, he represents the culmination of the Ghazi ethos, the warrior leader who pushed Islam's frontiers. On the other, he institutionalized the bureaucratic and military frameworks that would underpin Ottoman governance. His reign exemplifies what historian Cemal Kafadar describes as the synthesis of frontier and imperial paradigms. The consequences of his victories in the Balkans cannot be overstated. The vassalage of local Serbian lords, the capture of strategic towns like Sofia and Niš, and the demographic shifts through conquest and settlement laid the foundations for Ottoman control over southeastern Europe for the next 5 centuries. As historian Heath Lowry remarks, by the end of Murad's reign, the Ottomans were no longer guests in Europe. They were landlords. In sum, the reign of Murad the Farm was a transformative era in Ottoman history. He turned a militarized principality into a functioning imperial machine. Through institutional reforms, military conquest, and ideological framing, Murad laid the groundwork for the empire's classical age. His death at Kosovo was not the end of a dream, but the beginning of a new imperial reality, one in which the Ottomans no longer looked east to their Anatolian origins, but west to the European world they now claimed as their own. What happens when the death of a sultan becomes the catalyst for unprecedented conquest? In the shadow of Murad I's death at Kosovo in 1389, the Ottoman Empire stood on a precipice. Would the fragile structure his rule had forged hold, or would it fracture? Bayezid I, known as Yildirim, did not hesitate. With unmatched speed, he transformed uncertainty into momentum and led the empire into a decade of relentless campaigns, shaping the future of Southeast Europe and Anatolia alike. The death of Murad I at the Battle of Kosovo had the potential to destabilize the nascent Ottoman Empire. The victory was Pyrrhic, and the army's morale hung in the balance. Yet Bayezid's reaction was immediate. Even before his father's body was removed from the battlefield, Bayezid, with the support of key commanders, secured his claim to the throne, reportedly executing his brother Yaqub to eliminate any threat to succession. As the historian Halil Inalcik observes, Bayezid emerged as a ruler of intense energy, ruthless decisiveness, and immense ambition. This decisive moment not only stabilized the empire, but also revealed the autocratic and militaristic temperament that would define his reign. Bayezid's first major endeavor was to assert Ottoman dominance over the Anatolian peninsula. Following the decline of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, a patchwork of Turkic beyliks had emerged, often acting autonomously and rivaling Ottoman claims to supremacy. Bayezid viewed their independence as an existential threat. Beginning with Karaman, a principal rival and symbolic center of Turkish resistance, Bayezid launched successive campaigns that subdued the beyliks of Aydin, Saruhan, Menteşe, Hamid, and Germian. While some accepted vassalage, others were absorbed outright. He used strategic marriages, most notably to the daughter of the Germianid ruler, as instruments of diplomacy. His ambition was made explicit when he adopted the title Sultan-ur-Rum, Sultan of Rome, staking ideological claim to the Seljuk legacy. As historian Cemal Kafadar notes, by assuming this title, Bayezid signaled not only political domination over Anatolia, but a deeper civilizational mission to lead the Muslim Turkish world. This unification provided Bayezid with a stronger base for his army, greater taxation revenue, and ensured that no Anatolian rival could rise behind him while he campaigned in Europe. While Anatolia was being consolidated, Bayezid also renewed the expansionist momentum in the Balkans. Between 1390 and 1395, Ottoman forces campaigned against Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, and Wallachia. The city of Tarnovo fell in 1393, effectively ending the Second Bulgarian Empire. Vidin was taken soon after, and Serbian lords, including Stefan Lazarević, submitted as vassals. Bayezid's strategy in the Balkans was not mere conquest. He established a network of vassal principalities that paid tribute and provided troops but retained some internal autonomy. This system provided a flexible and cost-effective form of rule. According to Stanford J. Shaw, Bayezid's administrative genius lay in balancing coercion with co-optation. His Balkan vassals were not crushed but bound to the Ottoman military system. Yet, this method had limits. Wallachia, under the leadership of Mircea the Elder, offered persistent resistance. Bayezid's 1394 campaign into Wallachian territory met stiff opposition, with the Ottomans suffering defeats despite numerical superiority. It was a reminder that expansion in the Balkans would be contested. In 1394, Bayezid turned his gaze to Constantinople, the city that had eluded Ottoman hands for nearly a century. He blockaded the Byzantine capital and constructed the Anadolu Hisar fortress on the Asian side of the Bosporus, attempting to cut off the city from reinforcements and supplies. The siege demonstrated both his ambition and his understanding of the city's geopolitical importance. Though the siege ultimately failed due to logistical limitations and aid sent by European states, it was symbolically powerful. Historian Mark C. Bartusis argues, Bayezid's siege of Constantinople was not only a military maneuver, but a diplomatic message to Europe. The Ottomans were no longer a peripheral power. Despite their failure to take the city, the Ottomans extracted significant concessions from the Byzantines, who were forced into tributary status and allowed Muslim quarters within the city, marking the beginning of a deeper Ottoman footprint within the Byzantine heartland. Bayezid's Balkan campaigns and the siege of Constantinople alarmed Western Christendom. Pope Boniface IX called for a new crusade, and in 1396 a coalition led by Sigismund of Hungary, along with French, Burgundian and Wallachian contingents, launched a campaign to halt Ottoman expansion. Meeting at Nicopolis, the armies clashed in what would become one of the last major crusades of the medieval period. The European forces, disorganized and overly confident, suffered a devastating defeat. Ottoman discipline, combined with tactical use of terrain and reserve forces, including Serbian cavalry, secured a decisive victory. The aftermath was brutal. Thousands of crusaders were executed. As described by historian Jean W. Sedlar, the Battle of Nicopolis confirmed the Ottoman military machine as the most formidable in Southeast Europe and extinguished crusading fervor in the region for decades. Bayezid's triumph further solidified his dominance, not only militarily but psychologically. European courts now feared the Ottomans as a force that could not easily be undone by traditional feudal armies. Parallel to his military endeavors, Bayezid introduced key internal reforms. He strengthened the timar system, a system in which cavalrymen, or sipahis, were granted land revenues in exchange for military service. This allowed for a dependable and decentralized way of maintaining a large cavalry. Moreover, Bayezid expanded the devshirme system and reinforced the Janissary Corps. These elite infantrymen, recruited from Christian families and converted to Islam, became a central pillar of Ottoman battlefield success. Their loyalty lay with the Sultan alone, and their training and discipline made them one of the most feared units in the medieval world. Colin Imber remarks, Bayezid's centralizing efforts laid the groundwork for Ottoman absolutism. His institutional innovations were not merely military, they were ideological, redefining the very nature of Ottoman sovereignty. By the early 1400s, Bayezid's empire stretched from the Aegean to the Danube and deep into Anatolia, but his assertiveness in the east began to draw the attention of Timur, Tamerlane, the Central Asian warlord who claimed supremacy over the Muslim world. Bayezid's claim to the title of Sultan Urum, his refusal to acknowledge Timur's seniority, and his interference in eastern Anatolian affairs brought both men into confrontation. The looming shadow of Timur's campaign would test the limits of Bayezid's power, but that cataclysm belongs to the next chapter of Ottoman history. Bayezid III's reign was a watershed in Ottoman history. Through swift and aggressive campaigns, he not only expanded Ottoman dominion to unprecedented extents, but also redefined the political and ideological framework of the empire. His rule marked the transition from a frontier principality to a centralized sultanate with global ambitions. As Soraya Faroqi concludes, Bayezid's reign epitomized the duality of Ottoman power, rooted in military pragmatism, yet fueled by imperial ideology. Though his downfall would be as dramatic as his rise, Bayezid's legacy endured in the military structures he fortified, in the territories he annexed, and in the sultanic ideology he helped define. In the early 15th century, the Ottoman Empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The aftermath of Sultan Bayezid, the first's defeat at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, left the empire fragmented, with his sons vying for control in a period known as the Interregnum. Amidst this turmoil, Mehmed I emerged as a unifying figure, restoring the empire's cohesion and setting the stage for its resurgence. The interregnum between 1402 and 1413 was a period of civil war and political fragmentation, following Bayezid I's defeat by Timur. Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, each claimed the throne, leading to a protracted conflict. Mehmed, operating from Amasya, gradually consolidated power in Anatolia, defeating his brothers and restoring central authority. The decisive Battle of Chamurlu on July 5, 1413, marked the end of the interregnum, with Mehmed emerging as the sole ruler. As noted in historical accounts, the interregnum would last a little under 11 years and culminate in the Battle of Shamurlu on 5 July 1413, when Mehmed Çelebi emerged as victor, crowned himself Sultan Mehmed I, and restored the empire. Following his victory, Mehmed I focused on re-establishing the administrative structures of the empire. He reinstated the Taimar system, ensuring the loyalty of the military aristocracy, and worked to restore the empire's financial stability. Mehmed also emphasized the importance of justice and order, reinforcing the role of Islamic law in governance. His leadership was crucial in restoring stability to the Ottoman Empire after the chaotic interregnum. In 1416, Mehmed faced a significant challenge from Şeyh Bedreddin, a former chief judge under Musa Çelebi. Bedreddin led a revolt advocating for a syncretic belief system and communal ownership, attracting a diverse following. The rebellion spread across western Anatolia and the Balkans, posing a serious threat to Mehmed's authority. Mehmed responded decisively, dispatching forces to quell the uprising. Bedreddin was captured and executed, effectively ending the rebellion. As detailed in Lasudikra Researcher records, after Musa's defeat by Ottoman Sultan Mehmed in 1413, Bedreddin was exiled to Iznik. In 1416, he raised the standard of revolt against the Ottoman state. Mehmed adopted a cautious approach to foreign policy, focusing on diplomacy to stabilize the empire's borders. He reasserted Ottoman suzerainty over vassal states like Serbia and Wallachia and engaged in limited military campaigns to suppress dissent. Mehmed also maintained a delicate balance of power with the Byzantine Empire, avoiding overextension. His reign marked the beginning of a significant consolidation of power, which set the stage for future expansion and the establishment of the Ottomans as a dominant force in the region. Historian Maria Todorova critiques the oversimplified portrayal of the Balkans as inherently unstable, a concept she terms Balkanization. She argues that such narratives overlook the region's complexity and resilience. Mehmed I's successful restoration of the Ottoman Empire challenges these reductionist views, demonstrating the capacity for unity and effective governance in the Balkans. Todorova's work, Imagining the Balkans, explores the ontology of the Balkans from the 16th century to the present day, uncovering the ways in which an insidious intellectual tradition was constructed and mythologized. Mehmed's reign was pivotal in restoring the Ottoman Empire after a period of fragmentation. Through strategic consolidation, effective governance, and decisive action against internal dissent, he re-established central authority and laid the groundwork for future imperial growth. His efforts ensured the continuity of the Ottoman state, setting the stage for the accomplishments of his successors. In an era where the Balkans were perceived as fragmented and peripheral, one sultan's campaigns would reframe the region as central to the imperial ambitions of the rising Ottoman state. As historian Noel Malcolm starkly puts it, Kosovo should by all rights be a historical and political backwater. Yet under Murad II, it became a crucible of military ambition, European resistance, and Ottoman consolidation. Murad II, who reigned from 1421 to 1444 and again from 1446 to 1451, was a transitional figure in Ottoman history. He inherited an empire fractured by the aftermath of the Ottoman interregnum and internal rebellions. Halil İnalcık describes this period as a turning point. Murad II's reign marked a pivotal phase in Ottoman history, during which he successfully unified the empire and restored its political stability after facing threats of power struggles, civil wars, internal rebellions, and external interventions. From the onset of his reign, Murad sought to restore and centralize Ottoman authority, launching military campaigns against the Anatolian beyliks and European adversaries. His aim was not only the preservation of inherited territories, but the projection of Ottoman power deeper into Europe. The strategic focus of Murad's reign was southeastern Europe, where the fragmented Christian polities and the ambitions of Venice and Hungary intersected with Ottoman expansion. The despotate of Serbia under George Branković fluctuated between alliance and rebellion. Venice, controlling maritime routes, resisted Ottoman advances in Albania and the Aegean. Hungary, under John Hunyadi, emerged as the primary military antagonist. These conflicts were not isolated, but represented a broader resistance to the Ottoman frontier's transformation into a consolidated imperial domain. The Ottoman campaigns in Serbia and Albania aimed to isolate Hungary and secure the Western Balkans, paving the way for further military engagements. The most ambitious European counterattack against the Ottomans during Murad II's reign was the Crusade of Varna. Supported by the papacy and led by King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary, along with Hunyadi, the Crusader army sought to push the Ottomans out of Europe entirely. Franz Babinger notes, "The Battle of Varna was the last major effort by the Christian nations to drive the Ottoman Turks from Europe, and their defeat had massive consequences. On November 10, 1444, the two forces clashed near the Black Sea. Despite being pressured to abdicate in favor of his young son Mehmed II, Murad returned to command the Ottoman forces personally. The result was a devastating Christian defeat. King Władysław III was killed and the crusading effort collapsed." John Fine remarks, "The defeat at Varna in 1444 ended any serious hope of a Christian reconquest of the Balkans. The Ottoman grip on southeastern Europe was now secure, and Murad had once again demonstrated the resilience of the empire." The second blow. Only 4 years later, the Second Battle of Kosovo reinforced the permanence of Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. John Hunyadi, undeterred by Varna, led a coalition force of Hungarians and Wallachians into Ottoman territory, hoping to exploit any perceived Ottoman vulnerability. Yet, the battle, fought over 2 days in October 1448, ended in another decisive Ottoman victory. Stephen R. Turnbull details the campaign. Hunyadi led an army of 24,000 men, including 8,000 Wallachians, but suffered another military defeat without even seeing his Albanian allies. The symbolic weight of Kosovo, already steeped in the memory of the 1389 battle, was now reaffirmed under Murad II, becoming a cornerstone of Ottoman martial mythology. Kosovo, a region that, in Malcolm's words, should by all rights be a historical and political backwater, had instead become central to the Ottoman-European conflict, a stage on which the fate of empires was decided. These victories under Murad II did more than defeat European coalitions. They established the framework upon which Mehmed II would build. Murad's preference for practical diplomacy, such as renewing vassal ties and offering lenient terms to defeated foes, allowed the Ottomans to consolidate rather than merely conquer. His military reforms enhanced the Janissary Corps and established firm control over the Balkans, ensuring stability for future expansion. Crucially, Murad II laid the ideological and logistical groundwork for the Ottoman Empire's next phase. By reaffirming control over contested regions and demonstrating Ottoman military supremacy, he turned the Balkans from a volatile frontier into a staging ground for imperial consolidation. Murad II's European campaigns reshaped the balance of power in southeastern Europe. Through decisive victories at Varna and Kosovo, he thwarted Christian attempts to reverse Ottoman gains and secured a legacy of military strength and political acumen. As historians from Halil Inalcik to Franz Babinger and Noel Malcolm attest, his reign was a pivotal chapter in the transformation of the Ottoman state into an enduring empire. The stage was now set for his son, Mehmed II, to take the imperial turn that would forever change the world. O Constantinople, either I shall possess you or you shall possess me. With these words, Sultan Mehmed II, at the age of 21, embarked on a campaign that would not only alter the course of Ottoman history, but also redefine the geopolitical landscape of the medieval world. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant imperial power. The siege of Constantinople was a culmination of meticulous planning and military innovation. Mehmed II assembled an army estimated between 60,000 and 80,000 soldiers, including elite Janissary troops, cavalry, and infantry. A significant advancement was the employment of massive cannons, notably the Basilica, designed by Hungarian engineer Orban. This supersized cannon could fire massive stone balls weighing several hundred pounds, capable of destroying portions of the city's ancient fortifications. As Halil Inalcik notes, the use of artillery in the conquest of Constantinople represented a turning point in siege warfare, symbolizing the transition to early modern military strategies. To complement the land assault, Mehmed implemented a naval blockade, effectively isolating Constantinople. In a strategic masterstroke, he ordered the construction of a road of greased logs across Galata on the north side of the Golden Horn, and dragged his ships over the hill directly into the Golden Horn on April 22nd, bypassing the chain barrier. Stephen Runciman described this maneuver as one of the most imaginative feats of military engineering in the Middle Ages. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of relentless bombardment and several failed assaults, Mehmed launched a final massive offensive. The elite Janissary Corps breached the Theodosian walls, leading to the city's fall. Emperor Constantine XI perished in battle, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire. Mehmed's entry into the city was marked by a symbolic act. He proceeded directly to the Hagia Sophia, the grand cathedral of Eastern Christianity, and ordered its conversion into a mosque. This act signified not only the conquest of a city, but also the appropriation of its spiritual and imperial legacy. As historian Caroline Finkel puts it, the transformation of Hagia Sophia was the cornerstone of Mehmed's imperial ideology, linking Ottoman rule with the universalism of the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Following the conquest, Mehmed II initiated a series of reforms to transform the Ottoman state into an empire. He declared Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, the new capital, replacing Edirne. To repopulate the city, he deported Muslim and Christian groups from Anatolia and the Balkans and forced them to settle in Constantinople. In 1459, Mehmed ordered the construction of the Topkapı Palace, which would serve as the administrative and residential center of the empire. The palace complex was strategically located on the tip of the peninsula, offering panoramic views of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara. Its architecture reflected the grandeur of the empire, featuring elaborate courtyards, lush gardens, and majestic buildings. Mehmed also assumed the title Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome, asserting his claim as the legitimate successor to the Roman emperors. This title was more than symbolic. It represented Mehmed's ambition to position the Ottoman Empire as the continuation of the Roman and Byzantine traditions, thereby legitimizing his rule over the diverse populations of his empire. According to Cemal Kafadar, Mehmed's appropriation of the Roman legacy was not a mere flourish of rhetoric. It formed the ideological core of his statecraft. Mehmed's policies extended beyond administrative reforms. He also focused on cultural and religious integration. He established the Patriarchate of Constantinople, granting the Orthodox Church a degree of autonomy under Ottoman rule. This move aimed to placate the Christian population and integrate them into the imperial system. Moreover, Mehmed encouraged the settlement of various ethnic and religious groups in Istanbul, fostering a cosmopolitan environment. This policy not only revitalized the city's economy, but also reinforced the image of the Ottoman Empire as a multi-ethnic and multi-religious state. Heath Lowry observes, Mehmed's inclusivist policy in repopulating and restructuring Constantinople was a calculated effort to transform the city into a true imperial capital, mirroring the pluralistic nature of his empire. The conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed II marked a pivotal moment in world history. Through military innovation, strategic planning, and symbolic acts, Mehmed transformed the Ottoman Principality into a formidable empire. His assumption of the title Kayseri Rum and the establishment of Istanbul as the imperial capital signified a deliberate effort to position the Ottoman Empire as the rightful successor to the Roman and Byzantine legacies. As historian Franz Babinger asserts, Mehmed the Conqueror was not merely a warrior, he was a statesman who understood that empires are not built by swords alone, but by visions. This imperial turn not only reshaped the political landscape of the region, but also laid the foundation for the Ottoman Empire's dominance in the centuries to follow. The Ottoman Empire was not born in fire alone. It was shaped through ideas, administration, and myth. Dr. Emine Fetvaçı, Boston University. This insight encapsulates the essence of the Ottoman Empire's evolution following the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. While military prowess secured territorial expansion, it was the empire's sophisticated administrative structures, commitment to religious tolerance, and cultivation of a unifying Islamic identity that sustained its dominion for centuries. The period following the conquest marked the genesis of the Pax Ottomana, a time characterized by relative peace, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing across a vast and diverse empire. The Ottoman Empire's vast expanse encompassed a mosaic of ethnicities, languages, and religions. To manage this diversity, the Ottomans developed the millet system, a form of decentralized governance that granted religious communities a degree of autonomy. Each millet, be it Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, was allowed to govern its own affairs, including matters of education, justice, and worship, under the leadership of its religious authorities. This system fostered a sense of communal identity, while ensuring loyalty to the Sultan. Historian Bruce Masters notes that the millet system was instrumental in maintaining social harmony. By allowing non-Muslim communities to govern themselves in matters of personal law, the Ottomans effectively managed a multi-ethnic empire without imposing cultural homogeneity. This approach not only minimized resistance, but also integrated diverse populations into the imperial framework, contributing to the empire's longevity. While the millet system allowed for local autonomy, the Ottoman central government pursued a policy of administrative centralization to consolidate power. The Sultanate established a hierarchical bureaucracy staffed by trained officials, many of whom were products of the devshirme system, a practice of recruiting Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and educating them for state service. The central administration was organized around the Divan, the imperial council, which oversaw various aspects of governance, including finance, military affairs, and justice. The codification of laws, known as Qanun, supplemented Islamic Sharia law, providing a legal framework that addressed the complexities of a diverse empire. This dual legal system allowed the Ottomans to administer a vast territory effectively. As historian Halil Inalcik explains, the coexistence of Sharia and Qanun enabled the Ottomans to adapt Islamic principles to the practical needs of governance. The administrative efficiency, legal pluralism, and cultural integration achieved by the Ottomans culminated in a period of relative peace and stability known as the Pax Ottomana. Spanning from the 15th to the 17th centuries, this era was marked by economic prosperity, flourishing trade, and vibrant cultural exchange across the empire's territories. The Pax Ottomana facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas, contributing to the empire's wealth and the enrichment of its diverse populations. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Baghdad became centers of commerce and culture, attracting scholars, artists, and merchants from across the world. Historian Suraya Farokhi emphasizes the significance of this period. The Pax Ottomana created conditions under which economic and cultural life could flourish, making the empire a hub of global interaction. The transformation of the Ottoman Empire following the conquest of Constantinople was not solely a product of military conquest, but also the result of deliberate administrative strategies, cultural policies, and legal innovations. By embracing a multi-ethnic administration, reinforcing Islamic identity, and fostering religious tolerance, the Ottomans established a centralized yet flexible governance model that sustained the empire for centuries. The Pax Ottomana stands as a testament to the empire's ability to harmonize diversity and unity, creating a legacy that continues to inform discussions on governance, cultural integration, and religious coexistence in complex societies. As the story of the Ottoman rise draws to a close, remember this is just one chapter in the sweeping saga of medieval empires that shaped the world we live in. If you're interested in how another kingdom emerged from the ruins of Rome, watch our video on the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, where warlords and bishops forged a new order on the Iberian Peninsula. Or explore the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule, an epic tale of resistance, religion, and revival. Thank you for watching this chapter in the epic history of Islam. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't miss our other deep dives into medieval history. Explore the dramatic rise and fall of Muslim Spain in The Epic History of Medieval Spain Explained. Or discover the forgotten legacy of Europe's so-called invaders in our latest hit, From Huns to Franks, Barbarians Who Built Europe. Subscribe, like, and share to support historical storytelling rooted in research and made for serious history lovers. See you in the next episode.